So today's top show for season 5 with more than 7,300 downloads and counting is Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath with Neuroscience Research, 5 Ways to Superior Teaching. This is one of those episodes everybody needs to hear and re-listen to. Lots of exciting things in this show, and I hope you enjoy.
The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today.
Today, we're going to talk about neuroscience. Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath, author of Stop Talking, Start Influencing 12 Insights from Brain Science to Make Your Message Stick. And Jared, you have 5 ideas to make our teaching actually stick according to neuroscience. And isn't this something that teachers want anyway? You know, we're talking all the time. How can we get that message to remain in our students' minds?
With this book, we go into, 12 principles of how human beings learn, with the idea that, cool, as teachers, how can I then adapt my practices to best fit with those rules? And so I figured today, if we're going to do 5 things, I kind of pulled out 5 different chapters. Is that cool? Should we just tuck in?
Let's do it. What's our first?
Number 1 has to do with memory, and we call it recall. So for the longest time, we've been studying memory, and we were so interested in how do I put information in to make a memory stick? Like, it needs to be emotional, needs to be repetitive, all this stuff. And it turns out we were looking in the wrong place. If you want memory to stick, it's all about accessing the memory, recalling that memory, pulling it back up. Think about something like the periodic table, which I've studied dozens of times in my life. I've put that information in dozens of times. I couldn't tell you anything about it now because I just never accessed it. Whereas something like Game of Thrones, which I've only watched once, because I talk about it every day, because I read about it, because I debate about it, my memory for that show is so deep. And it's because every time I access the memory, that memory gets better, deeper, stronger. So rule number 1, we always say then, is recall. You want deep memories. It's how are you getting your students to access and actively bring that information up? Forget about how you're putting it in. It's how are they bringing it out?
So I've seen charts that show that, a student studies it in one day and then they study it halfway through the next day and then they study it. So this whole cramming thing, we know it doesn't work. We have to repeat.
And I'd say, too, with the studying, beyond simple repetition, with the studying, if all they're doing is rereading notes or rereading a chapter, that's just putting the information back in. That ain't helping. So as they repeat over time, it's got to be more and more access, less and less putting it back in. So rewrite your notes, try and teach somebody else, have a debate, have a quiz, not simply reread.
And if we really want to understand it, I guess that's why the teachers who taught us that were truly tested cumulatively, we actually remembered it.
Bingo. That's when you start to realize that something like testing can actually be an incredible learning tool when used correctly.
But it's just so hard. And do you think some teachers think because some kids memorize that means all of them should be able to?
Anyone should be able to memorize anything. It's just we don't know what kids are thinking about in between. So when you've got one kid that just shows up and is magically great at all this stuff, we think, oh, that was a natural skill. When in truth, they might have just been thinking about it all night. And every time they're bringing up facts and ideas while they're laying there in bed, that's helping them memorize it. So we miss some of the key bits. And so we start to assign that to natural skill. Well, this kid's good at memorizing. When in truth, no, it could just be that kid knows how to play that game really well.
Wow. Okay, so what's your second?
Number 2, spoken words and written text do not mix. So it turns out that when you're reading words, your brain processes that in the same exact way as though you were speaking the words out loud, listening to them. So just like you don't have enough brain space to listen to 2 people speaking simultaneously, you can hear 2 people speaking, but you can't understand them at the same time. Same exact thing. You can't read and listen to somebody speak simultaneously and understand both. So why does this matter? K through 5 really probably don't think too deeply about this, but once you start getting up into high school and things like PowerPoints and handouts, those start to enter the fray. Now we've got this issue that if you're trying to teach with a bunch of bullet points behind you on a board or a handout with a bunch of words, you're essentially asking them to do the impossible, to both hear you and read those words at the same time. They can't do it And to make matters worse, when they try and jump back and forth between them, which they'll try to do, they lose information from both. They'd be much better off either just putting the words away and listening or reading the words without you trying to speak over them.
One of my children is dyslexic, so he actually listened to the book being read as he read it, with his finger following across the page. So that you would say that dual encoding in learning reading is different from you're trying to deliver content, don't have the text and the words.
Yep. And that's a wonderful caveat. Learning how to read, it's still the best thing you can do is exactly that, is read while listening to somebody speak. But once you have reading essentially on autopilot, so when the words are there, you're just translating them into speech, that's where we start to get this kind of discrepancy. And if you want to get really interesting, you get that same bottleneck when you're writing. So we have a third thing to think about, and there's no real answers here. It all depends on your purpose. But note taking. Turns out you cannot write and take notes while listening to somebody speak at the same time. Something starts to get lost in that translation.
But, a lot of teachers won't let kids record on, Evernote or OneNote, and you can record the audio and the video and go back and look later. But there are teachers who literally won't let kids record, and it just makes me cringe, as a mom of kids who have learning differences.
And that's when ideally you start to go, okay, well, if you're not going to record or if there's not going to be access to, say, slides or notes afterwards, then you have to start thinking about, cool, how are we going to embed note taking into the session itself? Rather than saying just take notes as we're going, is there a way to every 10 minutes say, sweet, now we're going to take 3 minutes, do a free recall, or every 15 minutes we stop and we do group notes together? Some way to embed that process into the lesson itself so you don't clash and you make it a learning tool, something that actually boosts their understanding of the material as well.
Oh, wow. I could tell that I'm going to need to get this book, Jared. I'm ready for the book. It's not out quite yet, but it should be out by when the show airs. Okay, so what's our third?
I think I want to go with threshold for this one. So it turns out as you get used to an environment, your attention threshold starts to shift. Now, what this means is the world has a bunch of noise. It's got sights, sounds, tastes, and all these things are coming into our senses. So to process all of that, our attention has this thing called a threshold, which says, okay, anything below this threshold, we're simply not going to process. Something has to be powerful enough to break my threshold. Now, the longer I'm in one environment getting used to that, my threshold starts to move up. It's almost as if my brain says, okay, everything here is cool and safe. Fine, let's make it harder for you to pay attention to things. That way, if anything wonky comes out, you'll easily pay attention to it. But most of the rest of the stuff is just going to fall under the threshold and you won't have to worry about it. And this resonates more than during, say, a lecture or a direct content aspect of a lesson. But once you reach about 10 to 15 minutes of direct content, the kids are used to the room. They're used to the lights hitting their eyes. They're used to the hum of the aircon. Their threshold will start to creep up. And you need to find a way every 10 to 15 seconds to reset their threshold and buy yourself more time. Otherwise, it's going to be harder and harder and harder for them to pay attention.
How do you reset your threshold? Tap dance?
Essentially, all you have to do is break the kid's prediction. So if the threshold's going up because they're used to the environment, you need to do something that's unpredictable or changes the environment in some way. So it's as simple as if you're talking, you show a video clip or you tell a joke or you get them to answer a question or chat to someone next to them. Anything to break that repetitive pattern should reset their threshold and buy you another 10 minutes before it starts to creep up again. And you'll see the best lectures and lessons always have these little moments every 10 to 15 minutes where they ask you to do something or think about something. And they're doing that to buy more time afterwards to get more ideas over to you.
For sure. Okay, what's our fourth?
Oh, fourth. Why don't we go with story for this one? So the way the brain processes information is it essentially assumes that whatever just happened must link to and somehow drive what is about to happen. So essentially the brain thinks in cause and effect. Even when there isn't any cause and effect, it will drive that. If you think about dreaming, when we're awake and we think about the dreams we had last night, they're usually chaotic. Like 1 minute you're on a mountain, the next minute you're on an ocean, then you're taking a test. It's just nonsense. But when you're asleep and in the dream, it makes perfect sense because the brain is saying, well, if you're on a mountain and then the ocean must be connected, and it makes you feel as though that's a continuous story. So simply put, the brain thinks in narrative, in cause and effect story. So this means the more you can find the story behind the facts, you can start to mimic the way the brain naturally works, and it becomes easier for students to understand and remember the material you're talking about. And when I say find the story, it can be anything. Every fact has a moment when it was invented or discovered or occurred. And if you can find that right framing and turn that into a cause and effect narrative, so it's not just the Pythagorean theorem, it's the Pythagorean theorem because a bunch of mathematicians were trying to discover the face of God and determine this was the best ratio to use. Now people start to think differently and they can remember ideas a lot better and a lot longer.
Totally. And when you talk about history and you tell the stories, and I mean, so many times students will say, oh, I remember that story you told me. And it could have been 5 or 6 years ago. And they remember the stories. That's absolutely true. Okay. So what's our fifth?
Last one, and this one tends to get some people angry, so we saved it for last here, but it's facts always precede skills. And this one can get a little tricky at times, but in human beings, we like to think about competencies or skills as dissociable, as once you have that ability, you can apply that ability anywhere. But it turns out in human beings, we can only apply our skills when we understand the facts we need to apply them to. And this is why all learning trajectories will start with surface learning. You have to start with facts or else all your skills are essentially inaccessible. So to demonstrate, I thought I'd tell a quick story. This will only work for your listeners. So we've gone through this podcast. Chances are you've heard everything and understood everything, which means you as a listener have the skill of listening comprehension. You've been using it all along. So use that skill now to understand the story I'm about to tell you. So this would have been 2 weeks ago. It was the T20 Big Bash, and we're in the final over. My team up 9 runs, and there was only 2 balls to go in the last over. So essentially the other team's playing tip and go. We throw a Jaffa, lose a point. Next one goes through, slips for 4, then drives offline for 4. We go into a super over, drop 22 off of an off spinner, and lose a game that we should have easily won.
I don't. That's where you're going.
Now, unless you understand cricket very well, I'm guessing you weren't able to understand a word that just came out of my mouth. And that's because you don't have the facts. It doesn't matter that your skill of listening comprehension is good. Once I shift facts into a realm you don't understand, you can no longer apply that skill. So we have this issue with the brain where facts and embedding facts is what allows skills to emerge and be applicable. So bring this back to the classroom now. This is why a lot of people say before you go into project-based learning or before you go into exploratory learning, it's worth spending a couple days laying the foundational groundwork, because that's what's going to allow them to actually go deep and start to apply their skills to those new facts.
Absolutely. I've been through some courses where we call it front loading the words or front loading the content. And I rarely teach with textbooks, but I have one class with textbooks. You know, I'll ask kids, how often do we look at what's coming up? Because it helps us learn.
Absolutely. When we start to frame facts, then we can actually move forward with our skills.
One last question. What is something that you think a lot of teachers do that they think is teaching, but goes completely against what neuroscience says works?
Oh, okay. This is going to sound slightly weird, but I think one common practice that goes against the neuroscience of learning is stress avoidance. I think there's a big movement in education now to make kids feel as calm, as comfortable, as peaceful as possible. And although that's a wonderful goal for outcomes like well-being and self-control, it turns out if you want to learn, you need to feel a small bit of stress. Stress is what triggers the chemical cascade that allows you to start building memories. And this is why whenever you're learning something new and you're slightly uncomfortable, that discomfort is the sensation of learning. That mini stress, that is the sign that your brain is starting to update and change. So when we try and protect students from feeling any kind of stress or discomfort, and we always jump in and try and save them, that's not how learning happens. You want the brain to change, to understand, to take in memories. You've got to let it feel slightly uncomfortable, and you've got to let them sit in that. Not too long. I mean, I'm not talking days of stress, but I'm talking 15 minutes of struggle and stress is probably a good thing.
Well, in the video games that they love, I mean, if you look at some of the video game research, a 50% failure rate is okay.
and they love it. It's because they've depersonalized it. It's highly stressful. I used to play video games growing up, and I've broken a lot of controllers because you get stressed, but you've depersonalized it. You understand that's part of the gaming process, and you don't see it as a reflection of yourself. So how do we get kids to recognize that same stress is okay in learning? That's just part of the process, and it's not a personal reflection. When you feel stressed, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you're doing learning.
Okay, so teachers, here's the book. Stop Talking, Start Influencing, 12 Insights from Brain Science to Make Your Message Stick. Go out and get it, and let's apply neuroscience. And I've got a lot of thinking to do about this stress avoidance, but we've talked about memory and recall and accessing and practicing. The second one, we talked about spoken words and written text don't always mix, and to give time for that note taking. And please, teachers, let your kids record. Have the threshold in our environment, so we change things up every 10 to 15 minutes. Tell stories, and remember that facts precede skills. There are things that we need to front load and get in their environment. Thanks, Jared.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.